poetry panel. Smith, I'm sure, felt himself first and foremost to be a poet more than a fiction writer or an artist. Fiction writing was pretty much something he did to pay the bills. Art was something he did for himself. And as we kind of reviewed in the last panel, he had great highs and then somewhat lows on his poetry career. But to start off with, can each of you answer, what is your favorite Smith poem and why?
Well, that's
or
tough.
poem.
Yeah, really.
Pick a few.
Pick 1 out of 600.
Yeah.
I have a lot of favorites, but one I think that deserves to be mentioned is somewhat under recognized or estimated is Soliloquy in an Ebon Tower. It's a remarkable poem. It's the centerpiece of his The Dark Chateau. 100 lines. It's not in rhyme and meter, but it is iambic. It's just an amazing poem. He starts out there in his cabin in Auburn by himself, musing over his life and all his energy that's gone into his poetry and his writing. And he was poor as could be. He's like, what is the point? And, well, he answers that question. I would read that Soliloquy in an Ebon Tower. It's fantastic.
It's a very late poem, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
He worked on it. He had many drafts, and he put a lot of special work into it, more than usual.
Well, as a classical scholar, at least one who started as a classical scholar way back in my college days, I find Smith's interest in classical culture very stimulating. Lovecraft, of course, also was very fascinated with Greek and Roman civilization. And Smith wrote a poem called Memnon at Midnight. Memnon, there is supposedly, again, this was an ancient tradition, a statue of Memnon in Egypt that would have some sort of resonance or make a sound at dawn. And Smith wrote a poem about this, and I'll read you just, it was a sonnet, and I'll read you just the sestet. Lo, in the darkness, thick with dust of years, how many a ghostly god around his throne, with thronging wings that were forgotten fanes, stood ere the dawn restored to ancient ears the long withholden thunder of their names, and music stilled to monumental stone. That last line, I think, is one of the great lines in the entire range of English poetry. And there's so many of them. I mean, the first line of the Hashish Eater, how can we forget that? Bow down, I am the emperor of dreams.
It does command your attention.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so now everybody bow down.
Yes. But yeah, Smith's history of writing poetry is fascinating, and the previous panel touched upon that briefly. Clearly his influences early on were Poe. He says so. He read Poe at like the age of 13, I believe. George Sterling. A Wine of Wizardry came out in the September 1907 issue of Cosmopolitan. But no doubt Smith also read Sterling's first book of poetry, The Testimony of the Suns, which is 1903, and that was really Sterling's great contribution to cosmic poetry. And when Bierce read a draft of that, he was totally blown away, saying, "Wow!" And it's funny how Smith then became Sterling's kind of pupil, just as Sterling had been Bierce's pupil, and Sterling was conscious of that kind of passing on the tradition of this kind of cosmic fantastic poetry. And so Sterling helped Smith quite a lot in getting Smith established. He arranged for Smith's poetry to be published both in magazines and with A.M. Robertson in the Star Treader, which, as I say, is a book of 100 pages, which is a large book, especially for a first book of poetry. I don't think it sold quite as well as people think. I think what Robertson said was that he printed like 2,000 copies, but then he said he never actually bound more than 1,000 of them, and not even all those sold. But still, it sold pretty well. And I think we forgot to mention that after that, 6 years after, Smith published Odes and Sonnets. A slim book from the Book Club of California. I don't know how many people know about the Book Club of California. It's still a going concern.
Well, it's very prestigious.
Yeah, extremely prestigious. In fact, in some ways, that was sadly, the pinnacle of Smith's prestige as a poet. I mean, not a lot of people got published by the Book Club of California. This was a limited edition, quite expensive, mostly sold to members.
Were they new poems?
Though I think partly were
Yeah.
reprints of from Sartre, and some were new poems, but it was arranged by Albert Bender, who was one of Smith's patrons, gave Smith money over the years. And Smith did create a bit of a controversy by including the poem "Satan Unrepentant."
Oh, watch it.
I'm not sure that sat well. Smith was probably an atheist. I mean, almost certainly an atheist. But he was inspired, of course, by Milton in that poem, and kind of said, "Well, Milton had his Satan. Well, I'll have my own Satan." But yeah, Smith's poor health throughout the teens. He probably had some kind of tuberculosis. In fact, when he was like all the men in America had to register for the draft when the U.S. entered the war in 1917. I think his medical report said he was 5'11" and 103 pounds.
Wow.
That is thin. And he was rejected, of course, on that and other reasons. Later on, actually, in life, he became pretty physically fit.
Chopping all that wood.
Yeah. He said, by the 30s or 40s, he was like 5'11" and 150 pounds. He said, it's all muscle, So he recovered, But yeah, that contributed to his inability or disinclination to write. Aside from the fact that, he was having trouble selling poetry. I mean, poetry, even then as now, is a hard sell. It was more highly regarded in his day than ours. I mean, you could actually become, I wouldn't say you could make a career as a poet, but you could become famous as a poet. And there were many famous poets. And Sterling was on the verge of becoming famous. Didn't happen, but and they were talking about the shift in the poetic tradition at the time when the modernists came along, T.S. Eliot, William Carlos Williams, Amy Lowell. They scorned this kind of imaginative poetry. They thought it was somehow subliterary. It was a rejection of the late Romantic or late Victorian poetry in the form of Swinburne and Oscar Wilde and writers like that. They felt that was taking poetry in a wrong direction. It was antiquated. It was not real, and so their poetry is very different. And that change of temperament left people like Smith and Sterling out in the cold. And how are they gonna get published? And that's why Smith had to self-publish at least 2 of his poetry volumes of that era.
So, for my favorite, I haven't read a lot of Smith's poetry, but my favorite is a poem called "The Abyss Triumphant." Not a happy poem, as you can probably guess, but just the imagery and the finality and not angst is the right word, but anyway, that's my favorite. So, if Smith lived such a dreary and struggling life, poor, no electricity, climbing down the well to get the water, that kind of stuff. How do you think it was that his poetry is so cosmic, so sublime, and so weird, and just mind-blowing almost?
I think it was an escape. He lived in this rural, side of the hill, and he didn't want to be there. As Bob Elder mentioned, anywhere but here. And that was his reward, was creating, these incredibly beautiful other worlds, and I think his imagination took him out of Auburn.
Let's be clear though, even early on, Smith's poetry was not all weird and fantastic and unrelated to the real world. He could write some beautiful nature poetry. The Starcutter has some lovely, lovely poetry of that sort. One called "The Butterfly" that was one of the poems that George Sterling said, "This is beyond just potential. This is realization. You have rung the bell here." there was mentioned last time that yeah, there was a little bit of tension every now and then. Sterling was not a weird poet by any stretch of the imagination. He loved the imagination, he loved fantasy, but
He was romantic.
He was romantic, and he fairly consistently throughout the teens warned Smith against, you know, well, maybe you've done enough of that vein. You mined that cosmic vein more than any other poet in literary history. So maybe you want to come back down to earth. And Smith said, no, maybe not. But he did to some degree. He started writing love poetry based on, shall we say, some actual relationships he had with the ladies of Auburn. In fact, he wrote to Sterling, I can't remember when, in the 20s, it says, yeah, I've not been in love with an unmarried woman since I was 15. Whether that was just talk or not, who knows. But in one case, we know it was not talk. There was a lady in Roseville, which I think I saw. We passed as we were coming down from Sacramento, we passed a sign for Roseville, so not terribly far from here.
Not far.
Vivia Hemphill. They had a really hot romance in the early 20s. I'll tell you, it was smoky. In fact, there was a woman at the Roseville Historical Society who sent me a bunch of documentation about this woman.
There you
go. Yeah, fascinating.
Some letters, huh?
The letters by her to Smith are at the John Hay Library. By the way, not to boast, I cataloged those papers when I was a lad of 21 or thereabouts. Mark Michaud and I cataloged those papers for the library for free because that was their condition for accepting the Smith's papers.
Somebody else had to
It was
catalog
an
them.
enormous, gigantic collection. Take a look at the list. It took us a year and a half to catalog that stuff. There's lots of letters by Vivia Hemphill. She calls herself either Egypt or Cleopatra, and so any poem that's called Cleopatra or anything, or Antony and Cleopatra, they're all about Vivia Hemphill. I don't remember that they being super explicit. She didn't need to write this stuff down because it was actually happening, so she just wrote letters. We do not have any of Smith's letters to her, unfortunately. That would have been.
Did she burn them? Yeah.
Did she? They burned themselves, probably.
But thank you. I always wondered who the Cleopatra
Yeah.
was.
That's
She
Cleopatra.
was someone's
And I'll
mom.
tell you, when he published Ebony and Crystal in 1922, he included a poem called A Psalm to the Best Beloved. There is one line that, shall we say, speaks for itself. Between thy thighs is a valley of delight. Well, you can't get any more obvious than that. And there are other things like that. And that one line caused all the people in Auburn to have a little hissy fit. And the book sold well because of that. They all thought it was a bunch of dirty poems. Well, it wasn't, of course. And even that is actually very elegantly written, you know, and all Smith's love and erotic poetry are of that sort. And we can shift to a couple decades later when he got involved with a married couple, Eric Barker and Madeline Green. She was a dancer and he was a poet. And it's, again, abundantly obvious that they had a sexual threesome for years. He wrote the poem cycle, The Hill of Dionysus, based upon that relationship. And I'll just quote one part of that poem. Let me see which one I want to quote here.
Yeah, they were a important relationship.
And actually, if I remember correctly, that couple introduced him to Carol Dorman,
Yes.
who he married later.
Yeah, so okay, here's a stanza from The Hill of Dionysus. These things have happened even thus of yore. These things are part of all futurity, and she, and I, and he, returning as before, participate in some unfinished mystery. I mean, not a lot left to the imagination there. But again, exquisitely expressed. I mean, nothing vulgar or lascivious about that at all.
Yes, you can.
Smith was not bisexual. Donald Sidney Fryer says that he and Eric did not ever become sexually involved. They just direct their attention to Madeline.
That's one of the things I liked about Smith, as I did explore a little bit of his poetry, but it was that not only did it have the wild cosmic stuff, but it had a very, as you said, a very strong rooting in the classics, a lot of Greek references. And then, as you also said, a lot of nature. Here's one, pine needles, it's very short. Oh, little lances dipped in gray and set in order straight and clean. How exquisitely clear and keen your points against the cobalt day. Attesting what consummate art ye fringe the limpid firmament. O lances keenly sent to pierce with beauty to the heart. So even in just, you know, I know that was it Robert Frost that wrote about a tree? So did Smith. So let's see. There were many poets in the Smith circle: Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Samuel Loveman, Harold Donald Wandrei. How do you feel Smith compares to his contemporaries writing and his friends?
I think he was the original. I think he, Loveman was a poet when they met. But I would think that Wandrei, Lovecraft, I don't want to say they imitated, but they took his example and said, wow, if he can do that, maybe I can, you know, follow or come up with something close, but they couldn't.
Yeah, Smith was clearly preeminent among that group of poets, and frankly, I think superior to George Sterling overall also, and I think Sterling probably recognized that. Wandrei clearly was a kind of Smith fanboy at the very beginning. He let me see, how did he come? He saw an ad in Weird Tales for Ebony and Crystal, was it? And bought the book.
It was Ebony and Crystal.
Yeah. So he got in touch with Smith in 1924, about a year or two before he got in touch with Lovecraft. Samuel Loveman, again, was in touch with Smith at least by 1913, if not earlier. So we're always thinking that Lovecraft's kind of the hub of this network of colleagues, but in fact it was Smith who actually had a number of these colleagues before they ever came in touch with Lovecraft. In fact, Smith, when he received some of Lovecraft's story manuscripts, like the Beyond the Wall of Sleep, he sent them off to Loveman and to others. There's the hilarious story of when he got the story Dagon from Lovecraft. He sent it to George Sterling. Sterling
wasn't so impressed.
Well, no, Sterling goes, "Oh, it's a pretty good story. It's kind of in the manner of Poe, but the climax happens too fast, like a rabbit's amour."
Oh, there you go.
and so Smith, conveyed this opinion to Lovecraft, and Lovecraft promptly wrote to Edwin Baird, the first editor of Smith. "Well, you know what this guy George Sterling said of my poetry. This story is it's like a rabbit's amour." And Baird published that letter in Weird Tales. And Lovecraft like, "Oh my God, they're going to come after me, and I was starting to chop my head off." But it's
careful what you say.
It was funny. But yeah, Wandrei, I think, was very Smithian in his poetry, which is it's excellent poetry, but I think it has a heavy influence of Smith. Loveman probably not. He was a poet, well-established poet before he got in touch with Smith. Lovecraft is an interesting case. I believe that Lovecraft, when he started, he was writing a lot of poetry, very imitative 18th century poetry from the teens onward, and he basically stopped like in 1922, just when he came in touch with Smith. I think he was so blown away by Smith's genuine accomplishment as a poet that he said, "There's no way I can match this." But then 70 years later, he started writing the Fungi from Yuggoth sonnets. Within a week, he wrote 35 sonnets. I don't say they were influenced by Smith. I think they were influenced by Smith's example. He says he saw in Smith's poetry how to write vivid, vital poetry that is still, powerful and evocative without descending into modernist free verse. And I think that example inspired Lovecraft, just as the example of Lovecraft's fiction inspired Smith without necessarily, being an actual influence on Smith, except in a few stories.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I was going to make a similar comment, not quite so well stated. Thank you.
So let's now talk about the mastodon in the room, Smith's 580-line poem, The Hashish Eater, or The Apocalypse of Evil. In a letter to Samuel Loveman in 1950, Smith said of The Hashish Eater, is a much misunderstood poem which is intended as a study of the possibilities of cosmic consciousness, drawing heavily on myth and fable for its imagery. It is my own theory that if the infinite worlds of the cosmos were open to human vision, the visionary would be overwhelmed by the horror in the end, like the hero of this poem. So, I assume you both have read it. Would you recommend it, and what advice would you give to someone reading it for the first time?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's a long poem, but, 600 lines?
Yeah, 580, yeah.
It's a long poem. It's broken down into stanzas, sort of, sections, let's call them. Read it slowly. Have a dictionary, one stanza at a time. Chew on it for a while. Don't just try to sit down and read the whole thing, because you'll be like the guy at the end, and you'll be overwhelmed.
Yeah, it seems as if that poem is just a one kaleidoscopic, succession of weird imagery, but it isn't. Smith wrote a little paragraph that was meant to precede that poem. It was called "The Argument of the Hashish Eater." I don't have the text of it in front of me, but to my mind, that suggests that there was, I wouldn't say a plot exactly, but there was I think Smith had a sense of the sequence and a certain progression in that poem where that dreamer who claims that he is the emperor of dreams does become overwhelmed. And I wrote an essay about this subject called What Happens in the Hashish Eater, in which that triumphant opening is then confounded by the fact that he was, overwhelmed, and you can trait it in a number of ways. The pronoun I gets fewer and fewer as it goes along, as if that figure himself is kind of, descending into oblivion. It may be hard to get that again on initial reading, but I think that poem deserves a lot of study, but just appreciate it as an experiment in cosmic imagery.
I think that it was, he was taken over by the poem. He had the ideas, probably, most poets will think of things, they'll kind of mold them over and build them in their minds for years perhaps. When this came out, it was like bubbling out of his subconscious. He wrote the whole thing in a week or two. It just basically got it all down, and it was like he was not in control. He was like a conduit for this imaginative experience, and
but
it
it
shows.
because it was so long, it had no chance of appearing in a magazine. I mean, Sterling's Wine of Wizardry itself is only about 200 lines, and he had a mountainous difficulty getting it published. In fact, Ambrose Bierce worked like a dog trying to get that poem published, on Sterling's behalf, and he started collecting these rejection slips from Harper's and Atlantic Monthly and all these, prestigious venues.
You probably read the first several lines and went, no, this is not.
No. And Bierce said, I'm going to get these people who rejected this poem. So part of the reason why Wine of Wizardry was created such a furor in 1907 was that it was preceded by a long essay by Bierce called "A Poet and His Poem," and anyway, a lot of people thought Bierce was way overstating the value of the poetry and whatnot.
Well, even if you only got to the title, it was controversial. The Hashish Eater, what is going on here? And he had to, defend himself over and over about that, saying, no, it wasn't.
Actually, Sterling said, "You're not really taking Hashish."
Right.
No, I don't need that. I can come up with this stuff on my own.
An amazing job. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So, in addition to his regular poems, he also wrote prose poetry. And there's some instances of Smith reworking previous written prose poetry into a short story. Can you explain kind of what prose poetry is and how it's different from prose or poetry? And then give some examples of Smith's instances of those.
Well, Baudelaire was his inspiration. I think Baudelaire was more urban in a lot of his poetry. But The form itself is poetic, but it is prose. It's not in rhyme and meter, but it has so many poetic attributes. You know, a lot of description, a lot of beauty, a lot of atmosphere. To me, the prose poems are one of the most satisfying of all of his creations. It just he did what, 40, maybe 50 altogether, and they're just so dense and beautiful. You can read one slowly and then just assimilate it. You know, think about it. Maybe read it several times. Don't just sit down and read the book cover to cover. Similar to the hashish eater, you have to really enjoy it and let it sink in. They're like nothing else.
Yeah, the prose poem, as it evolved in English and even in French also, either can tell a story or not, can be philosophical or not, but it does, you know, it allows for the expression of philosophical or aesthetic perspectives in a way that neither prose nor poetry does. And in my humble opinion, I think Smith was the greatest prose poet in the English language. Bar none.
I agree with that.
There's not that many other examples.
There's not that many.
Yeah, I
also.
mean, Smith was to some degree inspired by Oscar Wilde. Wrote like 6 longish prose poems. They're longer than what Smith generally wrote. In my estimation, they're not all that good, frankly. There are not a lot of other examples of prose poems
E.R.
in
Edison did a
English.
beautiful one. I think The Midnight Garden.
Who was this?
E.R. Edison.
Did he?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with
I'll
that.
send you that.
Some people have claimed that Smith was influenced by a book called Pastels in Prose. This was a volume of French prose poems translated into English by Stuart Merrill, published in 1890. But I don't believe Smith read that book before writing his earliest prose poem. He started writing prose poetry apparently in 1913, and I think Smith got that Pastels in Prose a little later on. But clearly he was affected by that volume, because later on in his own life, when he started publishing poetry, these poems in fanzines or like the Fantasy Fan or the Acolyte, he would use the title Prose Pastels. So clearly, I think he had some idea in mind. That book contained translations from Baudelaire, from Gautier, from a number of other French poets. A fine volume, but I think Smith's better.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That leads into a good next question. Smith taught himself French in order to read and translate Baudelaire, the French poet. He also taught himself Spanish and wrote poetry in both languages, sometimes under a pseudonym. How are his poems in the other languages compared to the rest of his poetry? Did having to work in another language lessen them in any way, or?
Yeah, that's tough. That's a tough question,
Okay.
because I don't know Spanish terribly well. I know French, and the way he came to learn French is funny. He stubbed his toe, right? Chopping wood, in summer of 1924, 25 maybe, and got laid up for months. I don't know why.
Probably a little more than a stub.
Yeah, I don't know why it took so long. Anyway, the wood dropped on his foot or something like that, and I don't know. He was laid up for months. He said, "All right, well, I'll learn French, I guess."
Yeah, you're right. Something.
Just what else there to do? And then he almost immediately started translating Baudelaire. And it's interesting to see how he went about it. You can see again manuscripts at the John Hay Library. What he would do is do a fairly literal translation of the poems in Les Fleurs du Mal. There were, that book had 158 poems in it. We won't go into the history of that because it was banned in the same year that it came out in the same year as Madame Bovary. And both books were legal action was taken against them. Yeah, absolutely. I think Madame Bovary kind of escaped, but Baudelaire, his book was banned, and the full text was not published until like 1949 or something like that.
Certainly made it more interesting and
I guess, but there were multiple editions even in his lifetime. But there was a group of 6 poems that could not be published in French, Eventually, so eventually Smith did get a full text of Baudelaire. We're not exactly sure which one he had, but what he would do, so of these 158 poems, he translated almost every single one of them, but almost always in prose. At some later point, he would then versify them, but he only got around to doing about 20 or 30 poems in verse. And it's a shame, because if he had done the whole corpus in verse, it would have been the greatest translation of Baudelaire ever. I mean, without question, but he didn't get to it.
Well, that book needs to come out, Smith's
Well,
Fleurs de Mal.
I did publish, the third volume of the Smith Complete Poetry from Hippocampus does include the entire Fleur de Mal, as translated by Smith, with the French text on the facing page. Smith also did about 9 or 10 poems from Paul Verlaine, a bunch of other French poets. He translated some from Spanish. Again, I don't know these Spanish poets very well, but and the stuff written in French and Spanish is exemplary. I mean, he got stuff. He sent it to some French, editors and magazines. It's amazing that a non-native speaker could write so well. But I'm really not competent to speak about these.
So, like you, I don't know the languages that well. I can read them. To me, my first opinion, maybe because I didn't want to really study and listen to them, was that they were perhaps a little simpler than the poems that I like the best. But again, I'm not a competent judge of those.
So, what is a poem that you would recommend to someone coming to Smith Poetry for the first time?
Well, for the first time, well, maybe stay away from the really dense things. He wrote some simple. The Price, like 4 lines. Behind each thing a shadow lies. A beauty hath ever its cost. As in the moon-flooded summer skies, how many stars are lost. Very simple, very beautiful.
Sorry.
Can you look up for a second? Yeah. So
This is a selection called The Last of Living. It first came out in like 03, this is a new edition, which has some, this is, of course, illustration by Smith himself.
Right.
So that version is still available. But
that's by Hippocampus, and Hippocampus also produces a 3-volume book, I think, of all his poems.
yeah, that's I wouldn't say tough to go through, but that's a lot to go through. I think his Ode to the Abyss, all those early odes, which are in some sense free verse, but not really. I think those are amazing poems, and easily comprehensible. Let me see.
Was that the one that Sterling originally sent to Bierce?
Yes.
Yeah. Caught his attention.
That's right. And there was a little controversy about that, but let me just see here. There's some incredible Ode to the Abyss. Oh man. There's one passage that really got to Bierce, if I can find it.
I didn't realize it was an option to read a stanza. I mentioned soliloquy in an
Yeah.
empty tower. Can I?
Oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead while I'm looking for this stuff.
And it starts off slow. Again, I think I mentioned that here is Clark Ashton Smith, later in life, thinking that perhaps he's a failure. But he did work on this poem for many, many years. And it did. All right. Soliloquy in an ebon tower. And it starts, the poet speaks, addressing a framed picture of Baudelaire upon the bookcase. The lamp burns stilly in the standing air, as in some ventless cavern. Through wide windows, the midnight brings a silence from the stars, and perfumes that the planet dreams in sleep. The hounds have ceased to bay, and the cicadas to ply their goblin harps. The owl that whilom hooted his famine to a full-chapped moon has pounced upon his gopher, or has gone to fresher woods behind a farther hill, and Hecate has grounded all the witches for some glade-hidden Sabbath. In my room, the quick, malign, relentless clock ticks on, firm as a demon's undecaying pulse, or creak of Charon's oarlocks as he plies between the shadow-crowded shores. Evoked within the vaults of my funereal brain, voices awaken, sibilant and restless, tongues of the viper's charnel-fostered brood, half grown amid the shreds of winding sheets and crumbling wicker of old bones. They sing, those little voices, all the poisonous, importunate melodies you too have heard, O Baudelaire, in midnights, when the moon sank, followed by some cloudy hearse of dreams, into the skyless nadir of despond. That guy was depressed.
But, yeah, okay, so I will now quote just a little bit of Ode to the Abyss. This is a poem addressed to the abyss, in the second person. And he says, thy quietudes enfold paean and threnody as one, and battle blare of unremembered wars with festal songs sung in the roams of ruined spheres. In the roams, R-O-M-E-S, capital. That one line just thrilled Beers. He said, tell young Smith he's done a pretty good job.
I have a book that I got from Bob Elder, and it was the 17 Sonnets by George Sterling. He had given it to Smith and inscribed it to him, and he said, you write better sonnets than I do. This is George Sterling to Clark Ashton Smith. You write better sonnets than I do, but you can't beat me when it comes to their binding. He was saying that my book is a better quality book than your Auburn Journal Press.
That's a segue to what I wanted to talk about, the progression of Smith's poetry, well, not progression, or shall we say the publication of Smith's poetry. Star Treader, great book, got a lot of attention, then nothing, Odes and Sonnets, very prestigious, but then Ebony and Crystal and Sandalwood had to be self-published, and Ebony and Crystal, well, he made a bad decision by A, making a very big book, and B, having each poem start on a new page, which, with paper costs were getting very expensive. He had to pay $500 or more, I think $556, as I recall, from printing costs, and it never made up its that's why he had to write this column for the Auburn Journal, presumably for free. That's why he made up his debt to the Auburn Journal Press. Sandalwood, printing costs much less, partly because Donald Wanderer covered at least half the printing costs, I think. Not the whole, but about half. He was, he had money, Wanderer did, and then he was devoted to Smith. So.
But you think if he had stayed with Robertson, the publicity, the marketing, the book was
yeah,
so bad.
well, he apparently, if you read the letters to Sterling very carefully, basically Sterling was saying, it appears that Robertson only wants to publish me as a poet. So, the printing costs, especially after the end of the First World War, just shot up for whatever reason, and even he and Robertson apparently wasn't confident that Smith's poetry would sell adequately enough. Sterling was a reliable seller because he was always a fixture in the Bay Area. So.
Well, true, but not necessarily Robertson. But the point is, the book just died in Auburn. He couldn't publicize it. He sold copies to his friends and family.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, he had copies of Ebony and Crystal for decades. He was still selling. Then from after 1925, nothing in terms of poetry. Then of course he started writing his fiction, and he self-published Double Shadow and Other Fantasies, and that was also a mistake in many senses because there was a big, oversized kind of a book, very thin, not many pages, that he sold for $0.25. And even at that time, that was not a lot of money.
He printed like 1,000 copies.
He printed 1,000 copies, and he was selling that literally for decades. I think Forrest J. Ackerman bought a copy in 1959 for a little more than a quarter, but still, he still had hundreds of copies, under his bed or something.
Right.
But then, Archibald came along, started publishing his fiction, and Derleth, and especially Wanderai, says, we want to do a big selection of your poetry someday. Wanderai actually wanted to do the complete poetry, and Smith said, not feasible, because even by then it would be multi-volumes and just not possible. But Smith spent 5 years, 1944 to 1949, assembling what became selected poems, and did some radical revisions of, especially the early poetry in Star Treader. But then, as now, poetry doesn't sell. So Derleth kept putting it off. He just didn't have the money. I mean, Arkham House was on a shoestring. It barely made up its expenses. you know, and Smith died in 61, book never published. Derleth died in 71. I think the book may have gotten published, I can't write, either just before or just after Derleth's death. You know, a great book. I mean, really a monument of American poetry. It was published by Arkham House and, you know, whatever. Derleth did publish a couple of very small books, you know, in the 50s, yeah. Two of them, Spells and Filters and Dark Chateau, just as a way of sort of, you know, keeping Smith's poetry alive, as it were. Because Derleth himself, who was a poet, mostly free verse though, had a high admiration for Smith's poetry, and you know, wanted to sort of encourage Smith to you know, get him out there, because by then there was actually not that much fiction left to publish. He'd done like 4 Smith fiction volumes in the 1940s. And then that almost exhausted the Smith's output until...
At least the best.
Yeah, right, until Abominations of Yamdo came out in 1960, only a year before Smith's death. But that book had been, he had signed a contract 10 years before that. But again, Derleth just didn't have the money to get that book out there. So, you know, when Smith died, lots and lots of his poetry remained unpublished. Roy Squires did a great. Squires became Smith's first literary executor after Smith's death. First thing he did was get out Hill of Dionysus. They apparently were working on that before Smith died, so he definitely wanted to get that book out. And if you've ever seen Squires publications, they are impeccable. I mean, they are just. I mean, this guy was really incredible printer and you know, nice publisher. So
many different versions of the different. Well, you know, just example. You had a paperback like Hill of Dionysus. You know, you had the hardcover, you had the paperback, just different states.
Yeah, and of course he did little booklets like there's he published some of Smith's Spanish poetry in a little booklet. And
Donde duermes El Dorado.
Yes.
We have a copy of that downstairs.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a rarity, boy.
I bet it is.
Yeah.
He did a couple different batches. What were they called?
Seer of Cycles and.
Yeah, but there was sort of a generic title.
Fugitive Poems.
The Fugitive Poems.
Oh, there you go.
Smith, like 4 or 8 booklets of those.
Mm-hmm.
But again, those are just small things. You know, so when David Schultz and I decided, all right, we're going to publish complete poetry, we found so much unpublished poetry among all those manuscripts. And I'll tell you, my name appears at the head of that edition, you know, as edited by Joshi, David E. Schultz. It shouldn't have. It should be reversed. Schultz had been working on that since 1990. Man, and he got robbed of the credit. It was because that the volume of his translations came out first, because I had assembled that book basically as Smith. Schultz doesn't, you know foreign languages, so that volume 3 actually came out first, and he wanted my name ahead of his, I suppose. But then he felt the need to keep that sequence, you know, for the other 2 books, which he did most of. So whatever, Schultz is the guy who did the lion's share of the work on those first 2
David
books.
Schultz is amazing.
He is an incredible guy, very humble, very shy, kind of like Smith. Doesn't get out much. Doesn't leave Milwaukee, Wisconsin very often.
So
anyway,
yeah. So thank you very much. Just a second. I just did something I didn't. Okay. I'd like to end the panel. We're still going to have some questions, and we're going a little bit long because we have a lunch break after. But amazingly, Robert Elder, that Ron has mentioned, was able to record Smith reading his own poetry. So I'm going to play a poem, a recording of the recordings. It's a poem called Moly, and it's about a plant mentioned in the Odyssey that's supposed to be a magic herb. So I don't know how well this is going to work, and how well it will be understandable, but this is Smith's voice, if you wanted to hear what it sounds like. Oh, hold on. Let me...
The quality itself of the original recording, it was an old reel-to-reel, and
Right. All right, try it again.
Always wonder.
Okay, now I figured it out. Let me try it one more time.
Morning. Early years always wander up and down and here and yonder. We are they that are seek over sand, fell and peak, down desert, street and creek, through dank forest, sparkling holy, arms and monks and melancholy, for the flowers on moon. Flowers warm the flesh and heart, from the ground that searches right. Seek no more, seek no more, not on mountain nor on shore, not by noon, nor under moon, blows the plant of magic bloom. Not with eyes shall any find it, nor with fingers plucked and winded. From the dust of limbs and heart shall the roots of mortal start. Over wide forgetful grave shall the flower of mortal grave.
He really emphasizes the rhythm.
Yeah, there's a certain,
It's
oh,
Smith
sing-songy quality
Yeah.
of that, but still.
Yeah,
it's-
you can definitely tell that, you know, like Ron said, reading it, even in his prose, there's a definite rhythm to it. So, thank you, Ron and ST. Any questions? David?
I've been wondering, this has been like my main question since I started reading Clark Ashton's prose. The first one I read was the Lake of Enchanted Silence, which reminds me so much of so many lakes in the Sierra Nevadas. I was wondering if you may know any of the locations he was writing about in those prose.
As far as the lake,
I'm sorry, what was the name of it?
The Lake of Enchanted Silence.
I think, is that a prose poem?
Yeah.
yes.
So the question is, prose poem, Lake of Enchanted Silence, is it based on a real place? I believe.
I mean, the only thing I can think of as an actual lake would be the little tarn up on Crater Ridge. But Smith's cabin right there in Sky Ridge is on the canyon of the American River. And I don't know how if it's documented, but you know damn well he spent a lot of time down at the river. What else do you do in this town? You know, and especially in the middle of the summer, hot, he was down at the river. Maybe he had company, maybe he didn't. But I can't think of a lake in particular. Oh, there's the forebay, Housie forebay up the highway a little ways. He mentions that in a letter to Genevieve. That's about all I got.
Question here?
Yes, there's another famous protege of George Sterling was Robinson Jeffers, who I tend to associate more with the modernist movement, but I can't help but wonder, and I've never seen anything about it, was there any correspondence between Smith and Jeffers or any discussion between them about poetry?
I don't.
No, I don't
think so.
believe, I'm not sure, I mean, I have a great admiration for Jeffers, but I don't know that Jeffers' poetry is the kind of poetry that Smith really would have liked all that much.
Yeah, they definitely went on different tangents.
That's what I think too, but
Yeah.
because of the relationship with
Yeah,
Sterling.
but no, again, Smith, I mean, he was so shy, he
Yeah.
didn't feel like writing to people who he didn't think would want to hear from him.
Just to clarify, the question was another protege of Robert, George Sterling was Robinson Jeffers. And so was there a correlate or a correspondence between them? So, thank you. Alex?
Just seeking a comment because you mentioned the Hatch Eater poem and then also Baudelaire multiple times. Baudelaire, of course, wrote Artificial Paradise
Yes.
about loving wine, coffee, and hashish. And so did Smith have a copy of that, or was there a copy of that in his library, or was that the? You see where I'm going with this
Yeah,
question?
yeah. Okay. What is that book? Is that prose poems?
I think it's more
Just
essays
prose? Okay.
about his own.
I can't remember whether he had that one, but he was familiar with several different translations of the prose poems. Some of which he liked, like some of which he didn't like. He thought, I think Arthur Simmons had translated some. He said, oh, these are terrible. So Smith was a fairly critical reader of all this kind of material, and eventually he says, well, maybe I can do better. I am not, again, though, specifically aware that he was familiar with that.
It
Yeah, I've
could
heard
be
that.
Orientalism in general, or some like the Odyssey reference to that. The poem about the plants there. Anyway, thank you for your. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't remember hearing that title specifically, but if it was available, he would probably get anything by Baudelaire he could.
Right.
In the back?
Yes, you mentioned Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil, and kind of, it was revised over his lifetime. Baudelaire revised it continually over his lifetime. Did Smith ever think of it, because you talk about him selecting his own poetry, did he ever think of creating some comprehensive aesthetical choice for his poetry? Also, and you mentioned his revision of his poetry. Can you just talk a little bit more about how he would revise his poetry over time?
The question was, how did Smith revise the poetry, and was there kind of like a overall aesthetical decision or style?
I know that he was, while creating, composing the poetry, he worked at it constantly. I think every time he picked it up, he would change something. And it just stands to reason that later in life, when he had a chance to do it again, he would have some improvements to make or some changes.
Well, yeah, if you consider that the Star Treader was basically written as early, I mean, some of the poems probably date when he was like 15, and it was published when he was 19. It's funny though, some of the newspapers that talked about Smith, there was at least one, I think in Stockton, so Smith was 9 years old. He was not 9. 19 is pretty much of an accomplishment. 9 would be pretty remarkable. I think it was just a typo or something. But anyway, so then, when he started revising the poems, or at least assembling the poems for selected poems, in 1944, he was 50, 51. So the difference in his temperament and his outlook on life, I think led him to say, this early stuff, some of which he didn't even reprint. He did not include the totality of those early collections in selected poems. He just felt some of them were inferior. That's his choice. But even those that he chose to include, in some cases, revised fairly significantly. I have an example in here. I'm not sure I can find it because this book doesn't have an index. But yeah, he worked them over pretty significantly.
I don't know that he had a specific theme or style that he was trying to move towards in his later life, but constantly revising. He always wanted to do better, perfectionist.
Yeah, I believe there's been some excellent work done on inventorying the library that H.P. Lovecraft had. I believe you were involved in it. Has there been any similar kind of work done with respect to Ashton's?
Take that one.
Yes, we okay. Hippocampus is, as you know, undertaking. Basically, we, in the course of next year or 2 or 3, we will get every single word of Smith's work, including letters, into print. And that will include next year, not this year, but next year. Actually, this year we will have, aside from my biography and aside from one of your compilations of fiction, we will have a volume that will include a combined edition of his prose poems, essays, he didn't write all that many essays, and those epigrams. There are 700 epigrams. Don Herron had compiled a volume called The Devil's Notebook, but he didn't go back to manuscripts. The John Hay Library has dozens, if not hundreds of pages of scribbled epigrams, and God help David Schultz, he actually read all that stuff. Smith's handwriting is way worse than Lovecraft's. Oh my God, I just throw up my hands. I don't
He's
know.
constantly saying to me, he'll email me something, what is this? And you just
Somehow,
don't know.
with 3 or 4 heads putting together, we managed to decipher almost everything. Okay, so that's that. Then, next year, there will be a volume of Smith's juvenile fiction, almost all unpublished. A lot of it set in Arabia or the Middle East or India or Africa or whatever. That's the stuff he wrote when he was in his teenage years. Then we will do a new edition of the Black Book and a volume of his personal library. That's at a very rudimentary stage. We have a preliminary list. I guess he must have made a list of his library at one point.
I don't remember seeing one.
I could have sworn, I thought Scott Connor sent me some sort of a copy of it,
We
like a
made a- Scott-
handwritten
Scott and I
list.
made a list. I didn't see
Yeah.
one from Smith himself, but
Anyway, we have the rudiments of of Smith's library. It may not be everything, but it'll be a lot. He did. Even Lovecraft, who was poor, had a fairly extensive library. Smith was even poorer, and didn't have all that many books, maybe 500 or so. Samuel Loveland sent him a lot of books because Loveland was in the book trade, and I think he knew Smith couldn't afford to buy a lot of books. He just sent them to him. So that is in the works, and it'll be of some interest. He had a lot of Lafcadio Hearn. He had Kipling. He was very fond of Kipling early on, anyway. So it'll be illuminating once we get that out.
Great, thank you.
One last question. You got your hand up?
Right. So you had mentioned that you perceived Smith as being sort of a conduit. So I was, with his writing, I was curious of what your perspective was of what the creative source that was utilizing him as a conduit, or if Smith had sort of that idealization as well.
Well, as far as him being a conduit of some outside source, I'm not sure that he thought of it that way, but certainly that imagination came from somewhere. I think, to me, the more I learn and study Smith, it's just his incredible imagination, and that he was able to have the skill to be able to put that into to words. My point was really just in the Hashish Eater, it seemed to take him over, and it wasn't, he had the ideas, the thoughts, the basic framework, but when he started writing, it was just...
I could assume, though, I thought he got stuck at one point.
Oh.
I think he'd written like 300 lines and says, I don't know where to go with this. And I thought he put the poem away and they came back to it. I thought that's what I read in the letters to Sterling, but...
there was something like that, but I don't think it was too long of a delay.
Okay. You know what it was? Sterling, for some reason, took a long time to respond, and Smith got really, like 2 months passed, and Smith got really worried that Sterling didn't like the poem, but Sterling did like the poem, and thought it was great, but again, I think he was saying, marketing-wise, there's no chance of this. He didn't want to go through what Pierce went through trying to sell Line of Wizardry, so Smith just put it in Crystal.
Well, certainly, SD, you have me at a disadvantage, having being so familiar with all that material at John A. I've never been back there, I've never seen this stuff. And I'll have to have a specific something I'm looking for, maybe.
Well, I wish they digitized all that stuff. The entire Lovecraft collection, manuscript collection at John A. Library has been digitized. Anybody can access it. It's called the Brown Digital Repository. Go look at it. I wish they would do it for Smith, because there's such an enormous amount of paperwork there. You can't get it until you go there.
So, thank you very much. We're going to take a lunch break now. Unfortunately, because Charles Schneider is sick, he's not obviously going to be doing his poetry presentation. So we had a kind of a collector's show and tell of unique items scheduled from 1 to 1:30. We're going to move that to 4:30. So we now have lunch break from now until 1:30. I know that a number of people are probably going to go off site, and I wanted to give extra time for that and for you to go to the vendors and buy lots of stuff.